Hello and welcome on behalf of the University of Minnesota Retirees Association to today's UMRA AM with Professor Emeritus Jim Bowyer. A special welcome to the many new members who have joined us recently. We had a delightful new member event last week. If you've joined in the last year and haven't attended a new member welcome, I hope you'll come to the next one. Look for an announcement about that in the next few weeks. I'm Jan Morlock. I'm the president-elect of UMRA and chair of the program committee. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank UMRA members Virgil Larson and John Anderson for providing the technical support for today's event. John also created the UMRA in Review slideshow we played before the start of today's program, and how wonderful it is to see images of us in the same room together. UMRA member Eric Hockert is here on the Zoom stage today. He'll introduce our guest speaker, and UMRA member Mary Capel is going to moderate the Q&A. She'll be looking for your questions for our presenter. Here are a few tips to help you participate today. If you'd like to ask a question during or following the presentation, and I hope you will do that, there are two options. You can submit a question in writing by clicking on the Q&A icon that you should see on your screen. Or you can ask to be called upon by Mary by selecting the raise hand icon. Mary will then ask you for permission to unmute your mic so that you can speak your question. If you're unable to see either of those icons right now, try hovering your cursor over the bottom or top of your Zoom screen, depending on what device you're using, and they should pop up for you. There's also a closed caption icon. If you click on that, a real-time transcript should appear. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Eric Hockert to introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Jan. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this morning. Jim Bowyer is Professor Emeritus, University of Minnesota Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering. He is a specialist in wood-based bioproducts and environmental life cycle assessment. While at the U, he led a research group focused on environmental performance of structural and non-structural biomaterials, served as head of what was then the Department of Wood and Paper Science, and founded the Minnesota Cold Climate Housing Center. He also co-founded and for 13 years served as vice president of the Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials, an association of 14 major North American universities organized for the purpose of conducting life cycle assessments of bio-based materials and products. He has served as president of the Forest Products Research Society and of the Society of Wood Science and Technology, and as board member and chairman of the Tropical Forest Foundation, an organization with major operations in Brazil, Indonesia, Guyana, and Gabon. Upon retirement from the university in 2006, Jim founded a consulting firm focused on helping organizations to improve environmental performance and became an associate in Dovetail Partners, Inc., a Minneapolis-based environmental nonprofit, where he recently published a 20-part online series on responsible consumption. Jim has published widely on the topics of life cycle assessment, carbon tracking and reporting, bioenergy, green building standards, and environmental policy, and for many years has been a frequent speaker nationally and internationally on these topics. His latest book, The Irresponsible Pursuit of Paradise, and the topic of today's presentation, was a finalist for the 2017 Midwest Book Award. Jim, welcome to UMRA AM.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks to UMRA for extending the invitation to talk with you today. I'm going to go to slides here now. All right, what I'm going to talk to you about today is a problem. And in talking about that problem, in about the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of what seem to be non-connected topics. We're going to touch on population and economics, global dynamics, consumption, what it takes to support consumption, environmental policy, and then a little bit on what we need to do now. Excuse me, what we need to do now. And the problem begins right here. We are a nation of consumers, and we're a consuming nation, the likes of which the world has never seen before. We have larger automobiles, larger homes, and those homes and automobiles are less energy efficient than anywhere else in the world. We have more vehicles per capita than any other nation except for the postage stamp nations of Monaco and San Marino. And with less than 4% of the population, we have more than 90% of the ATVs, which include golf carts and four-wheelers and things like that. We have 75% of the recreational boats in all the world right here, and 67% of the RVs, and I could go on and on. We are consumers. We embrace consumption. Late in the year, every year, we have Black Friday to remind every citizen that we need to help our businesses remain in the black. We need to consume. Indeed, our whole society is based on consumption. To support that consumption, it takes raw materials, and at current rates of use, each American born today will consume about 3.2 million pounds of metals, minerals, and fuels in their lifetime. That statistic does not include a very large volume of wood that will be consumed. That's about 1,600 tons, and you'll think to yourself, well, I don't use that much in the way of materials. This statistic looks at all materials used in our society, building highways and football stadiums and shopping centers and so on, and looks at consumption on a per capita basis. We use a lot of stuff. But while we consume greatly and we embrace consumption, we're very enthusiastic about consumption, there's far less enthusiasm for acceptance of responsibility for the impacts of that consumption, which is to say, extraction of raw materials needed to support consumption. We have all kinds of concerns about what those things might bring to the environment. And of course, these concerns are valid, and all raw material extraction involves some environmental impact, there's no doubt about it. But when our concern becomes overwhelming, it can be a problem. Because we don't like the effects of raw material extraction and all of what goes with it, we have over the years put into place a whole series of rules and regulations and so forth, and they allow for delay in permitting, project initiation, restudy, and so on. Very often we see delay upon delay, and very often the net effect is no, that operations that are designed to provide the materials needed for our consumption, we won't allow them, and we won't allow them on environmental grounds. Now, of course, concern about the environment is certainly valid, but when concerns become pervasive, when concerns come to the point where it's extremely difficult to mount any kind of raw material extraction activity within the boundaries of the country, then that's a problem. It's a problem because the raw materials have to come from someplace. And as a result of our abhorrence, of our resistance to raw material extraction within our own country, of course we do some of that, but we don't generally like it, we are a massive net importer of the raw materials needed to support the things that we consume. The U.S. Geological Survey tracks minerals and metals consumption, and of the 85 minerals and metal products reported by USGS, the U.S. was a net importer of 74 of those 85 in 2020, including 33 of 35 minerals being critical to U.S. national security. And for over half of these, net imports were 50% or more. And we're also a net importer of wood and wood products, despite being a forested nation, an abundantly forested nation. And we're also a net importer of durable and non-durable goods of all kinds. If you count the raw materials which come in the form of finished goods, the number that I just talked about, all of those numbers become larger. So here's where we are. Here's where we are in 2019, and looking back to 1954. The lightest blue lines here are 25 to 50% net imports. The darker is 50, 100%, and the gray is up to 100%. And you notice here that the trend is decidedly upward. We're a massive net importer, and that problem is growing. And it's good to keep in mind that raw material consumption and imports are rising even with current recycling efforts. In other words, yes, recycling is part of the answer to this problem, but despite all of our best efforts in recycling and reuse, we're still increasing our consumption of virgin raw materials. Now, we are, as a country, a net importer on a massive scale, partly because a lot of the resources we need that are economically accessible lie outside of our borders. But it's also the case that we're a massive net importer because, as I've indicated earlier, environmental regulations and policies and what can only be described as fierce opposition to local raw material procurement have created barriers to domestic production and therefore have increased costs. U.S. Geological Survey 2018, a common misconception is that the United States must import mineral commodities because no domestic resources exist. In general, the United States does not lack mineral resources. For example, this country, has resources of 43 mineral commodities with high net import reliance. In other words, we have the capacity to supply a great deal more of our raw material needs from domestic sources than we do. We just choose not to do it. So as a result, we have huge quantities of raw materials flowing to the United States on a daily basis, huge quantities. And in effect, and in the process, we're exporting the environmental impacts of that raw material procurement. And we're doing it every day. Now, I've looked at a lot of environmental impact statements, environmental impact assessments that are complaints that are brought by groups. And what is detailed in those documents is there is concern about raw material extraction, about all of the things I mentioned earlier: noise, impacts on groundwater, impacts on wildlife, endangered species, and a lot of concerns. And again, those are not concerns that are trivial. They're very real concerns. But when we do environmental planning in the United States, and we're in the process of making decisions about, well, should we extract raw materials domestically or not? What we never consider, is what will the impacts be someplace else if we don't do the raw material extraction here? What are the impacts someplace else of natural and wild areas, scenic beauty, rare and endangered species, ground and surface water, recreation, and so on? We never ask that question. And so the fact of the matter is, the reality is today that people and environments all over the world are impacted by first world consumption, and often negatively. All right, I want to switch gears completely now and talk about changing realities. I think we're all familiar with the fact that the world population has grown a great deal. I was born in a year in which the world population was 2.5 billion. It's 7.8 billion today. And when I was old enough to realize such things, I'm aware that the world was a whole lot different then than it was now. In any case, we've had quite a bit of world population in the last century. And if we look forward to what's likely to happen, virtually all of that growth is likely to occur in the developing nations of the world. In other words, the less developed nations, the less economically developed nations than we are. So population is growing. And by the way, population is growing, but it's growing at a decreasing rate. Some people still write that we've got exponential growth of population, but we don't. The rate of population growth is slowing, but nonetheless, population is growing. And it's expected we're going to reach somewhere around 9.5 billion, and some estimates even higher within this century. Well, let's turn our attention to economics. This is a graph of gross world product. So that's the sum of the value of all goods and services translated into a common currency, in this case, US. And this is constant dollars. So these are trillions of 2015 US dollars. And so you can see there that there's been real growth in the world economy of about 4.5 times at the same time that world population increased by a little over double. In other words, population is increasing, but economic growth is proceeding at a rate more than double the rate of population growth. So we've got two things going on, both of which will drive consumption, both of which are driving consumption. So if we break down economic growth and we look back not very far, just to the early 1990s, and we look to see what a trend is, and we break this down into advanced economies and emerging and developing countries, what we see is that the emerging and developing countries of the world have had economic growth rates consistently greater than developed nations. And in many cases, that growth rate is much greater. My son lives in the Philippines. He works for the Asian Development Bank. Most people don't think of the Philippines when they think of economic growth, but I was in that country in the mid-1960s with the military, and then I go there frequently today, and the transition from then and now is absolutely spectacular. Philippines has had a growth rate consistently of about 7 to 7.5% per year for decades now. So Metro Manila, a rather large city, has 3 malls in it. It has a number of malls, but it has 3 malls in it that are bigger than the Mall of America, and all of them pretty much have the same stores that you see in the malls here. And there are people in there, the stores are full, people are walking out with full shopping bags. It's a sea change in a short period of time. So we look at the share of global economy attributed to country group by income level, and we can see that things are changing. The dark part of the graphic here is high income countries. And you can see that in 1997, only, a little over about 25 years ago, the gross domestic product, the world gross domestic product, was completely dominated by the advanced countries such as the United States. So we flash forward to 2017, only 20 years later, and the advanced countries' economies have grown, but notice the percent of world GDP that are controlled by, that is accounted for by the most developed countries is far lower percentage than it was just 20 years ago. If we look at middle income countries, which is shown by this lighter blue, notice the extent to which those countries are expanding, becoming a more important part of world gross domestic product. So if we look at this in terms of middle class, what is the World Bank, for example, define as an economic middle class? An economic middle class is a group of people who can afford more than just the basics. They can afford more than just food, shelter, and clothing. They can begin to think about buying some other things. So in 2009, only 12 years ago, The global middle class looked about like this in comparison to the rest of the world. The darker blue here is developing Asia, okay? In 2016, notice that the global middle class has grown quite a bit in just a 7-year period of time. By 2030, look at this in comparison to this. So a 21-year period of time, and it looks as if the global middle class, those people who are capable of buying things beyond necessities, that group of people is growing rapidly as a percent of world population. So the fact of the matter is that world raw material demand is growing very rapidly. And keep in mind that raw materials for a long, long time have really been kind of the wheelhouse of the most developed countries of the world. We, for a long time, have viewed the resources of the world as pretty much ours to use as we saw fit. But the world is changing, and it's changing quickly. Here's world growth and consumption of principal raw materials, 61 to 2018. So this is about a, 57-year period of time, not very long in the big scheme of things. Population growth during this period was 2.5 times, but look at the growth in steel, cement, aluminum, plastics, and wood. These are basic materials in the world economy. Population growth grew by 2.5 times, steel more than double that, cement, 7-8 times that, aluminum, same thing, plastics, about 15-16 times, and so on. This is a picture of global economy average, looking at average demand growth 1997 to 2017. The red line on this graph represents population growth. So here's population growth, and notice the growth of the world economy, the growth in demand for energy, the growth in demand for grains, and so on. But look at metals in this picture. The world demand for metals is literally exploding. Here's another way of expressing how things are changing. This is the dark blue here is 1997, the lighter blue 2017, so just a 20-year period of time. So in 1997, the advanced economies of the world, this is the advanced economy share of world consumption of basic energy and mineral resources. So in 1997, the advanced countries of the world used 60% of world consumption of petroleum. And 20 years later, it was down to 40%. And it's not because this declined, it's because this grew, because the developing countries' consumption grew greatly. Look at natural gas, coal, steel. Look at these changes in just a 20-year period of time. There is competition for the world resources that has grown up in a very short period of time that's never been seen before. We talk about electric vehicles and how this is something that a transition we need to make, and we need to do it to help the environment. What is often not talked about is, as we move along that road, is that development translates to a rather large increase in demand for the world's resources. And here in Minnesota, we talk a lot about nickel and copper and cobalt. Look at the increases in demand for these kinds of things as we move toward a world which is dominated to a much greater extent by electric vehicles. So as this situation unfolds, the developed nations are focusing on areas where economically and technically available resources are concentrated. We're looking more and more for resources because we can see that this is a critical issue going forward. And what we find is that a large portion of available mineral deposits are located in the developing countries, and that well over half of global exploration for minerals is occurring in the developing countries. We also see that developing countries have accounted for almost all increases in global mineral production in recent years. And this is partly because those are undeveloped resources being developed for the first time, but also because the most developed countries of the world don't want minerals extraction activity to occur within their own boundaries. It's not only the United States that has this problem, although we're a principal example of that phenomenon. And we also see, as I've indicated, that consumption of minerals is rising very rapidly within the developing countries themselves. And so really for the first time, really a situation that's developed over just the last decade or two, we now find that there's a tug of war developing between the developed and developing nations. Again, the developing nation or the developed nations of the world. And when I talk about developed nations, pretty much, if you go back to 1975, if you may recall, we created, which was created in the world, the G7. The G7 were the largest economies of the world, the largest economically 7 countries, and they met to talk about problems and perhaps dispense advice to the others in the world. And those countries were the United States, Japan, Germany, UK, France, and Italy, and Canada. That was the G7. By 2000, only 3 of those countries remained the largest 7 economies in the world. And by 2050, it's predicted that only the US and perhaps US and Japan will remain as part of the largest countries of the world. So there's been a very much of a shift in economics throughout the world. And now all of a sudden we see nations that we really didn't foresee not very long ago being competitors for resources are very much so today. EU, there's a Apollinaris group within the EU concluded after an assessment that the developed countries of the world, traditionally the dominant consumers of minerals, as well as major producers, are finding themselves progressively marginalized. So the problem I'm talking about today is not just an ethical problem, and it is very much an ethical problem that I'm talking about, but it's also a strategic issue that we need to think about for our country going forward. I'll just touch on recycling just a moment. I've indicated earlier that recycling is certainly a part of the solution to this problem, but it's not the whole solution to this problem. United Nations Environmental Program in 2011 examined global recycling rates for 60 critical metals and metalloids, and they found that of the 60, recycling rates for over 2/3 were less than 50%, and for over 1/2, less than 1%. And a lot of those metals and metalloids that are in the less than 1% category include things like rare earth metals, the kind of things that are very much in evidence in the cell phone that every one of us carry today. Just a word about technology. Technology is also a potential solution here, or at least partially so. And I could give a lot of examples about exciting things coming along that promise to reduce demand for metals and so on, even including in my field. You may not know that you can make a computer chip out of highly crystalline cellulose that comes out of wood. So there's a lot of things going on, but if we're going to rely on technology, then we're going to need to fund it. And we're going to need to fund it to a much greater extent than we do today. Again, the Apollinaris project in Europe looked at technology and then they looked at national investments being made in research and development focused on this issue and concluded that there were only 2 nations in the entire world that were investing appropriately in these kind of issues. One of them was Japan and one was the United States. Okay, so we've got a problem, I would suggest. That problem is ethical. That problem is strategic. It's economic. What do we need to do to change? When I talk to students in my earlier university days, and when I go out and talk to general audiences today about this issue, one of the things that's behind all of this is that people want what we're doing to be sustainable. So sustainability is a big word. It's an important word. And if you look this up, there are all kinds of definitions about the word sustainability. But when you really get down to it, and when you talk to people about what this means, what they really mean is they want things to stay as they are. They want their kids to be able to grow up with clean air and clean water. They want them to be able to go to the lake, to catch fish, you know, to have enough money to enjoy the things in life that Americans have come to enjoy. That's what they mean by sustainability, fundamentally. This is one of my favorite quotes. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And that's certainly the case today. What do we need to do? I could give an hour presentation on this alone, but just in brief, we need to moderate our consumption, and we very much need to take more responsibility for the impacts of that consumption. We need to move toward a closed loop society in which we recycle things and use them over and over. We need to develop low impact, substitutes for critical materials. We need to develop new and renewable resources and a combination of these things. We also, I believe, need to develop greater awareness of the local and global impacts of our consumption, and then think about the issues of global equity and consider how we might view the situation if the shoe were on the other foot. I think another thing we need to do is to think about what characteristics or actions really define an environmentally concerned citizen, political leader, or environmental organization. We've gotten a little fuzzy on that designation, I think, and we've come to view anybody who tries to stop, thwart, or obstruct raw material extraction as an environmentalist, and I think we need to rethink that. In any case, I think we need to rethink and then withhold support from those that seek to maintain the current state of affairs. And then finally, we need to consider the risk from a strategic point of view of maintaining the present course and then just simply assuming that world markets and economic systems will take care of whatever social and resource allocation issues arrive. There's a very real and growing concern about the potential for resource wars in the world in the not too distant future, which is entirely avoidable. We need to examine resource supply issues and related environmental issues and seek to lower barriers to domestic raw material procurement. I was not at all a Trump supporter, but one of the things President Trump did during his administration was to lower barriers to domestic raw material procurement, and he was pilloried for that. That's one thing that I thought needed to be done very much, and I'm concerned that we're about to go back and go back to where we were before in that regard. So I'm going to wrap things up right there, and I hope we've got a lot of questions along these lines. And thank you for listening.
Well, Jim, you've left me with a deep sense of guilt for every purchase I've ever made at Target.
Good.
Rats. So
No, not really.
kind of hoping you get it. So I love that map showing all the raw materials coming to the US and then all of the environmental issues we export. Don't we also export jobs to other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a common question that comes up, and I guess I would respond this way. In looking at environmental impact assessments and complaints brought before the courts in order to stop a certain kind of activity, I've never seen ever written in one of those documents that the purpose of this objection is to help people in other countries have jobs. Never seen that. I guess the other observation I'd make is that when the United States puts tariffs on things, which we have come to do somewhat frequently, we never put a tariff on import of basic raw materials. never. We do put sometimes a tariff on finished raw materials. So if our objective in our environmental policy is to help other peoples of the world have jobs, then I think our position should be that, well, if those other countries have raw materials, then what we should do is help them develop an industry which actually will carry those raw materials all the way to a finished product and then import that to allow them to realize the full economic benefit of the resources they have. Instead, what we're all too happy to take basic raw resources and then value add here. But so yes, there are jobs in other countries tried the raw material extraction, but that's not why we do this.
All right, well, so Larry Rudnick is asking, for environmental challenges, people are concerned about the cost of making changes, but truthfully, that cost we actually benefit long-term. Can your list of suggested changes be cast in that form?
So I guess the question is, can those lists of suggestions be cast in a form that would reduce costs to us? Is that the question basically here?
Well, that essentially, we often see things as the out-of-pocket cost, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
if I make this environmental change, it's going to cost us. But the truth is, the benefit outweighs the cost of. So, is there a better way of framing the argument, if you will?
Well, there probably is, and that's a good suggestion. The reality here is, however, that what I'm saying is that in needing to bear a greater responsibility for our consumption means ultimately that we're going to begin to see in various parts of the country the impacts of our consumption. I would argue that that's going to help us probably think more about what we consume and consume more deliberately and perhaps less. As to the cost implications, it's not completely clear. It could actually cost us more to go down this road than it does now by a little bit, or it may not.
Chip Peterson is a provocative question. All of our current economic models seem to be predicated on the desirability and viability of open-ended economic growth. Do we need to devise systems that are based on totally different assumptions?
Yeah, I wrote a paper about 30 years ago in which I talked about one of the things we need to do is put our best minds to looking at how we could have a prosperous economy without growth. And a number of other people have observed that as well. The idea that we need continued growth just simply has to be rethought. If for no other reason, I don't know if the people in this seminar have read the Star Tribune in the last few weeks, but there were a couple of stunning editorials in there about basically one started and said we need unlimited population growth so that we can continue to populate have workers and all that kind of stuff. And if you do even basic economics as to compound growth calculation, that's just simply not sustainable. And anybody who says it is just doesn't know anything about mathematics, I guess. And by the same token, if we don't have population growth, and we may perhaps be coming to a point where this century population growth will end, then what? If we have an economy that only works if we have growth, and there's no growth in population, well, then what are we going to do? So I agree very much with the questioner. We need to rethink the idea that we need continuous growth.
So other than this guilt that I'm carrying now, thank you very much, you point out that we need to take more responsibilities. So how do we do that? For the impacts of our consumption, what form of responsibility do we take? How can we, do I just stop shopping at Target?
No, I would back this up and say we need to take more responsibility for the environmental impacts of that which we consume. And if in conclusion, if we start to see more of those impacts, which we're largely sheltered from now, I think we might actually consume less. But I would say one thing is, as a concerned citizen, if we're now contributing to an environmental organization which consistently demonizes the raw materials extraction industry, and I would argue that this whole business of thwarting extraction activity in the United States has even become almost an art form within the country, and it has broad public support. As a citizen, I think that needs to be rethought. Think very hard about any environmental organization that you're supporting, which routinely opposes all that kind of development. Just think about it a little bit. And then, in Minnesota, we have a copper nickel debate going on. There's nobody or very few people talking about the consumption end of this. But there needs to be, that very much needs to be part of this discussion. I'll leave that on the table there for a minute, but we can circle back to our domestic situation or to the state situation here if somebody wants.
Well, this actually was the second part of Jan Morlock's question. What is the responsible citizens' response to the proposals for metals mining in Minnesota?
So I've looked at, I think, I've read everything I can on this issue. And what I see, I've gone to the websites of opposition groups and so on. And first I'd say this is a very tough call. This is a proposed activity that's right on the brink of an area that's pristine and very important to a lot of people. On the other hand, what I hear people say is something like the following. We know for sure that there have not been copper nickel mining, especially copper mining around the world that has not had major environmental problems. We know this. And therefore, we will not allow this kind of activity in Minnesota because you can't do it without major environmental risks and major environmental problems. Okay, if we know that to be sure, then how can anybody who has that position not be opposed to the use of copper? But there are no groups opposed to the use of copper. In fact, we have groups that widely embrace use of copper in the form of wind towers and electric vehicles and so on and so on. If we know that environmental damage will be caused by use of copper, we should decide we're not going to use it, period. Now, is there a risk of mining copper in Minnesota? Is there a risk? Yes, there is. All right. We say we will not bear the risk. We will have zero risk. There's a bill in the legislature right now, which is a prove it first bill, which basically says, there has to be a mining operation of this scale in the world for 20 years, and then we'll think about it again. Okay, come on. But in the meantime, there's no proposal we stop using copper for the next 20 years. So what should a concerned citizen in Minnesota do? I'm glad I'm not governor that has to make this call. But my intuition tells me we need to rethink this, and then we do need probably to go forward with mining activity in that area of the state. That's my take on this.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there a country or even a culture that actually consumes and produces as you're proposing, one that can serve as a model? This is from Dave Hansen.
There are certainly countries in the world that consume less than we do. I mean, Europe, and we constantly see in Europe, quality of life surveys are done, and the United States is well down the list these days. And I look at the lists of countries in which people seem to be happier and so forth, and then I go look up consumption statistics. Europe, for example, uses half the amount of energy on a per capita basis we do in the United States. Why? Because through conservative and liberal governments alike, they decided a long time ago that they would put a high tax on energy consumption. And so what happened over the years, economies respond to a signal like that. And so they've developed, their buildings are much more energy efficient, their cars are smaller. If gasoline costs $8 a gallon, you're going to have a smaller car. And so they've developed along that line. Norway is moving toward 100% electric vehicles within a foreseeable timeline, and so on and so on. Are there countries who actually consume less voluntarily? It's been written that no nation has ever voluntarily reduced their standard of living, i.e. consumption, voluntarily. And I think other than some maybe communes and so forth that have made that decision, I think that quote is probably true. So in a long answer to a short question, no, I don't have any examples of a large nation that has voluntarily consumed a great deal less, except that I'd say this, there are countries that are voluntarily putting carbon tax on their consumption. Even Canada is doing that, at least in Vancouver. And people are accepting those taxes, and it is very much beginning to cause a shift in the way they consume toward a less environmentally impacting mode of operation.
Interesting. Sort of along those lines, Ginny Hansen is asking you to talk a little bit more about recycling or closing the loop.
Well, there's a lot we need to do in recycling. You may be aware that the recycling rate in the United States, if we look at household waste, municipal solid waste, our recycling rate in the United States is 32%. After a long, long history of trying to bump that number up. And we're kind of proud of that 32% number because not all long ago it was like 20%. But in Europe, the recycling rate for municipal solid waste is a full 10 percentage points higher. I think it's even 13 points higher than ours is. And country by country, they're making a very, very concerted effort to improve that rate. It's on every country's, they're measuring these kind of things, and I'm very much one who believes if you measure it, it will improve, sort of a thing. Within the Dovetail Consulting Group that I'm part of here in Minneapolis, we have one of our associates lives in France. And so he constantly gives us updates of what goes on in there. In the United States, one of the problems we went to single sort recycling. Very cool because we could get more people to recycle. But what's happening in single sort recycling, if someone comes along and happens to dump food or a liquid, half of a Coke into a recycling bin, it ruins the whole thing. So we often see entire trucks that are filled with paper and other things that would normally be recyclable are turned right around and they go to the landfill. In France, our associate there tells me that they have a number of different recycling bins and they sort things and they do it and they have a much higher recovery rate. In the United States, 50% of aluminum cans used for beer and pop are not recycled. Well, the impact of not recycling a single aluminum can is large. I mean, think about a can that's filled 2/3 with gasoline, and that's the energy equivalent of not recycling that can. Anyway, we don't do it. So we need to recycle more. We need to develop incentives for recycling cell phones. Cell phones are often not recycled either, and each one of those phones has about 50 critical minerals in it. Many of them obtained at high environmental costs. We need to put incentives in place, or either carrots or sticks, whatever it is, to try to encourage more recycling. And we need to be deliberative about it. Right now, it's way off the radar screen. Because as I look at state budgets and priorities, that's not there.
Well, we have had a distracting year now, Jim. So.
Well, we have, and it's very discouraging what's going on,
Yeah,
for sure.
it totally is. So Chip Peterson's asking, we're Americans, right? So how do we apportion blame for the current dilemma? We like to do that. Stockholder expectations? Is it the advertising industry that's promoting consumption? Is it the political power of capital?
I think if we want to apportion blame, we should all go buy ourselves a large mirror and look in it every morning and think about this stuff. No, absolutely. I hear people try to blame advertising and say, "Oh, they made us consume." Come on, folks. No, we can, and we complain about our politicians, by the way, but we tend to elect people that we want to be in power, whether we'll admit it or not. We elect people who allow things to continue as they are. We don't like change, and so on and so on. If this still is a government of, for, and by the people, despite everything that's been written in the last few years, it is. And if we want change from the government, we have the power to contact those who we have put in office. We have the power to take them out of office if they're not doing what they're supposed to, and so on and so on. We can do that on a state level. And look, we can change what we're doing as an individual citizen. And then we can make ourselves an example to neighbors. And this starts with us. It absolutely does.
So let me just ask, when you're making a purchase decision, what do you look at very specifically?
Well, I'm a life cycle assessment guy.
Mhm.
And if you look at the consumer goods you buy today, quite a number of them have environmental labels on them. And those environmental labels mean something. There are something like 500 environmental labels out there today. And so, holy smokes, what do you, but strategically, you know, you look as a shopper, there are things that you tend to buy again and again and again. You go to the grocery store, there's a brand you like and you buy it again and again. Well, if you have things that you buy again and again, then you can afford to take a little bit of time and check out what does that little label on that product mean? What does it mean? Find out what it means. And is that something that I want to support? And is this product different? Is the product I'm buying not environmentally certified? And why isn't? And what does that mean? Those decisions can be made. One of my favorite examples is bottled water. Bottled water has become a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. And there are people who routinely buy bottled water all the time. When across the United States, tap water is safe. A lot of bottled water products are bottled with municipal water sources. Over 60% of the bottled water sold in the United States is bottled from municipal sources. And yet people are willing to pay 1,200 times on average the price for that water. But when they make that purchase, they're also purchasing a plastic bottle, of which today 7% get recycled. That bottle is made out of petroleum, natural gas, actually as a basic raw material, feedstock, and then it's thrown away and it goes to landfill. What are we doing? One of the most favorite bottled water in the United States, because it's trendy, comes from Fiji. If you do a life cycle assessment of a bottle of water from Fiji, it's off the end of the scale. Why are we doing this? It must only be that we either don't care or we don't think anything about it when we make these kind of purchases.
So it's a strong think before you buy push here.
I have Oregon State University Extension produced a number of years ago. I actually have one here in my hand. It's a little billfold size card, and it's called an unshopping card. And it's you pull this out just before you would pull out your credit card. And the first question on this list is, do I really need this thing I'm about to buy? And I think that's a really important question. Now, there's a whole bunch of other questions about, is it overpackaged? How long will it last? If it breaks, can it be fixed? How will I dispose of it? What happens to it after I dispose of it? What's its environmental cost? Is it made of renewable or recycled materials? Is it recyclable or biodegradable? Could I borrow, rent, or buy it used instead? So on and so on. These are a lot of the questions we need to ask ourselves. And again, we need to become more aware of the environmental history of the things we buy. Everything we buy has an environmental legacy to it. Everything, even if it's made of recycled materials. And we just need to think a bit about this.
Thank you. Martha Kelly is sending her thanks too. Thank you for talking about bottled water. And also she has a question about the impact of our thinking on materials disposal angles of US communities.
Say that again.
What is the impact of this line of thought of how we are looking at this on the track management or is this right, Martha? Or materials disposal angles of US communities?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I would say this. You know, I do consulting work out of my little office that I'm sitting in here, and I use a certain amount of printer paper and so on. A lot of us do. And when we throw that printer paper into mixed recycling, into that single bin, this is the highest quality paper that money can buy. There's nothing like it in the world. We take this completely for granted, but this is a highly engineered piece of stuff that's right here. And when we throw it in a bin, it's going to be consigned to the very lowest level of paper recycling, if it's recycled at all. But if a community several times a year, for example, would hold a shredding event in which you could simply separate your printer paper as you dispose of it into a separate thing, and then every 6 months or so take it down to a shredding event, it would have a huge impact on what that paper going to the right recycling level. If communities would decide on their own to go away from single sort and back to something a bit different, that would mean that more of what we try to recycle actually winds up getting recycling, that would help. If we would engage our city councils in discussions about recycling and how to make it more efficient and effective. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do here, I think, even at the city level, that could change the trajectory. I'm not sure I answered that question, but anyway.
No, you did. It's about trash cycling. It's trash recycling and how we do this. I think, first of all, thank you. I think there's some very provocative thoughts, and I think that we probably have more power with our cities and our communities than we know, just by asking questions about recycling. My little neighborhood is one of the first that did composting in Minneapolis. It worked, so they extended it beyond. So, and it's because we asked, we pushed.
I go to a fair amount of city council meetings and things, and it's shocking to me how few people do that. We complain about what government does or doesn't do, but we're not engaged. And I'm also been somewhat engaged in a group called Citizens United, which is a whole nother story. But part of that effort is actually engaging with government. If we don't like what government's doing, we all need to become more engaged with our elected representatives at all levels of government.
Well, with that profound thought, I will thank you very much and turn this back over to Jan Morlock. Thanks for the questions. We've rolled through about a dozen, and have a great day, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim Bowyer. You have attacked some of my secret biases. You've made me uncomfortable, which is a good thing on this subject. And you've definitely pushed on my capacity to think more globally about what I'm doing. Thank you, Eric Hockert, for inspiring this program and making it happen. Thank you to Mary Capel for managing the question and answer period, which is where I always learn so much. And to everyone else who made this program possible today, that's John Anderson, that's our UMRA News editor, Chris Mortensen, and our technical director for today, whom you cannot see, but who is doing a lot of work, is Virgil Larson. I noted that William Seifert posted a link in the Q&A to the unshopping card that Jim referred to in his presentation, and we'll make sure that gets maybe into the information in the newsletter about this presentation, as well as other places where we post this information. For next Tuesday's workshop, I hope you'll be there. It's April 20th. We'll have National Park Ranger Sharon Steitler. She's also known as, get this, the Bird Chick. And she is going to tell us about opportunities for birding along the Mississippi River and what's going on with those noisy conferences of crows that we see everywhere along the river gorge between Minneapolis and St. Paul. At our noon forum on April 27th, our featured guest is Professor Michael Rodriguez. He is the Campbell Leadership Chair in Education and Human Development. And we've asked him to talk with us about the tough things and the signs of hope when it comes to preparing our education professionals to help us get to a place of educational equity. So I encourage you to register for both events if you haven't already. We have a terrific lineup of programs in May, including our annual meeting and elections. Don't miss that. Chairman of the Board of Regents, Ken Powell, will be with us that day in May. The program committee is also working on ways for us to get together in June, July, and August. So watch for more information about that in the future. And please consider making a contribution to the Professional Development Grants for Retirees Fund. It's a resource for university retirees for research and continuing professional development. It's very easy to make that contribution online. So thank you again for joining us today. There were 53 of us in the room today. It brightens my week to get together with other UMRA members, even if we have to do it online. So until next time, until April 20th, or next time we get together, stay curious and be well, everyone.